Hi, welcome to Foresight's Neurotech group. We're really excited today to have Angela Thornton here. And today you'll be discussing our futures of mind uploading, public perceptions and narratives. And this is work that has been going on in collaboration with a few others. And yeah, we're really excited to hear how can we communicate better? What does the public think? What are narratives that work? What are some that are perhaps less successful? So thank you so much for joining. I will be here featuring as your slide master, so we'll see how that goes. But please just move me along by saying next, and I'll try to keep up with it naturally as well. All right, then off we go.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Hello, everybody. Apologies again about a lack of camera and any background noise. So I'm an early postdoc researcher at the University of Nottingham, and my thesis looked at mind uploading, and very specifically the public response to the concept. I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail later, but there's actually hardly anything published in terms of public response to neurotech generally, actually, and not just mind uploading. What I would like to put a huge disclaimer on, given the expertise of this audience, is I am not a neurotech expert. I'm not a bad researcher, but I'm definitely not an expert in the kinds of things that a lot of you are. So from that point of view, bear with me if I lack any technical knowledge in the questions. But the reason I use mind uploading it was a vehicle for me to understand future developments. Because mind uploading, as I'm sure you're aware, is a subject that really engages people and provokes discussion. Most people have seen some kind of depiction of mind uploading through science fiction. So it's a really good topic to get people talking. So why mind uploading might not be a question that you would necessarily ask me. But trust me, when I started my PhD in 2019, that was pretty much all everybody asked me. Why mind uploading? And then how does it have any relevance whatsoever to what's going on in the world? Hopefully, since 2019, a whole lot has changed. And as I'm sure you're all well aware, there's lots of discussions about developments in neurotechnology, particularly in conjunction with AI, and discussions around how to look after neuro rights, our neural data, and keep them private and secure. So I was quite lucky because actually through the years of my PhD, I actually ended up working on a topic that actually became a lot more relevant to people. And the fact that UNESCO have actually said in a fairly recent report that things that are science fiction are coming here already, I think is an indication that we are aware that things are changing. But hopefully people have the foresight to realise that we are in a slightly different world. Now I'm just moving something around because it's gone a little bit weird. Perfect, thank you. When I started my research, one of the things I obviously had to justify was even a research gap. And I've indicated here that, and I mentioned before, that the response to the understanding of the public response to mind uploading is quite limited. Even though when I Googled mind uploading, I think in 2019, there were thousands and thousands of publications, academic, scientific, and also in popular media. But when I actually did a literature search, what I found is there were literally half a dozen papers looking at how the public felt to neurotechnology, and there were just 2 papers looking at mind uploading and the public specifically. Both of those were conducted by a group called the Morality of Intelligent Machines in the University of Helsinki. The first paper looked at cognitive factors, which might influence how people react. And they looked at some really interesting things, including anxiety about death, thoughts about suicidal acts, and also links to an interest in science fiction, as in reading science fiction or it being part of a hobby. And what the group actually found is that if you were scared of death and you didn't like the idea of suicide, you were more accepting of mind upload. We don't really understand from that paper exactly why that was. It was a quantitative paper, so they looked at a lot of different relationships and correlations, but you didn't really get so much of an understanding of the why. But they also found, which to me is quite intuitive, that if you're interested in science fiction, then you're more likely to approve of mind uploading. I actually looked at that in some of my work and I replicated that finding. That's some additional evidence towards the fact that if you're interested in science fiction, maybe mind uploading is something you might be slightly more favourable to. The second paper they did in 2021 was really interesting. Again, I've got these and I can send them. There's a link in the references. They looked at people's acceptance of mind uploading and personality traits. So those of you who are aware of the dark triad will know that it's Machiavellianism, a word I can never say, let alone spell, psychopathy, and narcissism. And the group theory at the time was that perhaps psychopathy, if you were high in psychopathic traits, you might be more favourable to mind uploading, which I find a slightly disturbing theory, but that's where they started from. But what they actually found is that people who are high in Machiavellianism traits, so the manipulation, the self-interest, etc., they were more favourable towards mind uploading. What I would say is that there's additional research required on both of those, but they're quite interesting. But I found it really surprising that we're literally 2 papers by the same group who'd chosen to discuss this topic. The other thing I got asked a great deal, in addition to why mind uploading, linked to it, as I said earlier, is why does it matter? My argument, coming from a university and a background that I'm sure many of you do, where responsible research and innovation are really big words, that we should engage everybody, all stakeholders, with this kind of technology and development, not just academics, not just scientists, because people are stakeholders too. And as neurotech develops, as AI develops, it's part of our world. It's part of our world for everybody. So that is my justification for why I think this kind of discussion is important. So this is quite a small slide, but there's quite a lot of words around it. So I knew that when I started my research, it was probably going to be quite a difficult topic to research. People are interested in it, people are engaged in it, but you're trying to ask people to look far into the future. And what I found is a really large evidence base that says researching the future, and specifically future technologies, is challenging. And most of that comes from the domain of human-computer interaction. So I spent a lot of time reading and learning about how people in that field engaged with people about this kind of far future technology. Out of all the things I looked at, and there were loads, the thing that really interested me were games and digital games, because games can transport people into fantastic and hypothetical situations in the same way that plays can, that books can, etc. And I needed to be able to replicate that kind of transportation and engagement, because what I found really early on when I started talking to people is there's quite a polarity in opinions. You either are fascinated by the concept, you can see multiple benefits, which I'll talk about in a little bit later, or you're terrified or appalled by it. There's not a great deal in the middle. And what I also found is no matter how you approach the topic, and no matter which method you use, if you talk to people one-on-one, if you put them in groups, people stuck to their original position. And it was really hard to get them to think about it in a different way. And obviously, I wanted them to be challenged and stretched, and I wanted them to think about different viewpoints. And if they were negative about the concept, I wanted to encourage them to think about some of the benefits, and vice versa. I really wanted somebody to design me a bespoke website. But unfortunately, the limitations of time in a PhD and also budget means that I could not raise the many thousands of pounds it would have taken. But I was really lucky because I was able to create a quite simple storytelling website that incorporated things from existing high-end productions. Because again, being at the University of Nottingham, we have copyright, which means that I can use a decent proportion of work without falling foul of the authorities. So that's what I did. There wasn't a great deal of choice. I spent many happy hours looking at different games, looking at different shows, to try and find some kind of media that I could use as a stimulus material. And the two I came up with, you may well be aware of. The first one is Amazon Prime's drama Upload, which I think is on series 3, although I might be slightly out of kilter. And the other one was a first-person role-playing game called Soma, which was written by a company called Fictional Games way back in 2015. So they were actually quite ahead of the curve. Both of these are very different. You may well be familiar with them, but bear with me, I'll give you a really quick synopsis in case you're not. They're different, but they both dealt with key themes or themes that I knew were important to people because of previous qualitative research. So for those of you who aren't familiar, a really brief snapshot. So uploads in a futuristic world, the rich and powerful predominantly can buy a utopian digital immortality. There's this place called Lakeside. It's amazing. You can turn a dial and you can adjust the seasons. You can do pretty much everything. Upload was actually billed as a comedy, and a lot of it is quite funny. However, as the series progresses, you find a lot more commentary on some of the sort of darker themes, like privacy, accessibility, socioeconomic imbalance. So it was quite useful from that point of view. I was able to use a bit of light and a bit of dark. The role-playing game Soma, that title comes from the Greek, which I can't pronounce, but that basically indicates that the body is distinct from the mind or the soul. So this kind of dualist perspective. And what was really great about Soma is the developers were actually really creative. They looked at lots of things like consciousness, identity, the self, free will, and subjective experience, which you wouldn't necessarily expect to see in a game that's classified as a horror game. So I was basically really lucky. I had two things, which they weren't ideal, but they gave me enough material to work with so I could basically put a website together that had a little bit of explanatory text and then had video clips which showed different aspects of mind uploading potentially, which I could question around. The site isn't live at the moment because I'm not data collecting, but I do have a preview link which I can share if any of you at any point want to go and have a look at it and click through and see what I did. I'm now going to spend a bit of time talking about some of the results that came out of the website. This is Afterlives, which started to feel a little bit like my life's work at some point. As I said, I identified scenes, I edited, and I tried to weave them together to tell the stories of the two main protagonists in Soma and in Afterload, Nathan in Brain's Gone, Upload, and Simon in Soma. So this is the storytelling website. That's what it looked like. So let me just talk a little bit before I go into the results about the profile of some of my participants. As you can see from here, it's not a huge sample, 128, but it's not bad in comparison to the fact that there's very little data out there. I haven't actually found anything as yet that's been published that has this sort of empirical approach to mind uploading. Before I started, I asked people to look, before I introduced the main characters, Nathan and Simon, and showed their story, I wanted to try and get a benchmark before people were primed of how aware they were of the concept of mind uploading. I also asked about faisability. And as you'll see a little bit later when I go through some of the results, interestingly, faisability to mind uploading has significantly changed from 2020 to 2023, 2024. So the first thing I asked them was, how aware are you of the concept? And I used a really straightforward 5-point scale where 1 was not at all aware of mind uploading and 5 was extremely aware. Now, this might seem like a slightly strange chart to some of you. I'm actually an ex-commercial market researcher, which is probably why I do a slightly strange chart. But we quite often in industry use something called the top 2 and bottom 2 box. So if you give people a 5-point scale, the top 2 box, not surprisingly, is people who score something 4 or 5. And the bottom 2 box is 1 plus 2. And so you find out the net of whatever it is you're asking, in this case awareness, by taking the bottom 2 off the top 2. And as you can see here, that gives you the final score of net awareness. This rationale for taking out moderate scores, for example, 3 on a 5-point scale, is something called a removal of the zone of indifference, which is a really good term. You're trying to find the people that are at one end or the other of the scale. So as you can see, you've got just under a third who are aware of mind uploading, either very or extremely. 47% weren't. So that ends up with a net negative score of awareness, i.e., more people didn't know anything about it at all or weren't aware of it versus actually were. So although awareness was limited, net favourability at the time was marginally positive. What is really interesting is I look back at my earlier data, as I alluded to previously. I did some early studies about 2020, and net favourability, same question, same scale, obviously different sample, was -32. So actually from 2020 to 2023, when this work was done, favourability had significantly increased, and that is statistically significant. I don't know why. I have to chuck that out there. It might be something that you have theories on. It might be something we talk about in the discussion. I can only wonder, maybe it's greater exposure to just technology generally. AI is part of our everyday life. Maybe more people are aware of brain-to-computer interfaces. I genuinely don't know. And it's a really interesting finding to me. It's more positive than it used to be, and it's significantly more positive. So the next slide is science and technology. I asked this because I wanted some kind of context around people's general attitudes to using science and technology. I didn't explore transhumanism specifically, but I asked people to what extent they agreed with using science and tech to expand our capabilities. And that could be either physical capabilities or mental capabilities. And as you can see here, all but a small minority of the 128 people I spoke to believe that we should be using science and tech to develop ourselves to some extent, which I found quite interesting. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is embodiment. In Soma, particularly, the protagonist Simon is uploaded and then downloaded or embodied in various different forms, and one of them is a robot. When I asked people how they felt about the prospect of being uploaded and then downloaded into a robot body, it wasn't a particularly popular concept. 3/4 of them were like, I don't think I want to be a robot. And as somebody said, I think I'd just feel anxious if I woke up in something that I didn't recognize, particularly if it wasn't human. Now, I don't have all of the answers or all of this understanding to why people didn't react particularly favorably to being in a robot body. But it might be that's not how they would perceive their ideal embodiment, for example. I personally would love to be a robot. I can see lots of huge benefits to it, but I wasn't one of the participants. So having talked about robots, I asked people how they would like to continue existing. Nathan in Upload is an avatar, a realistic avatar. It has to be set in a virtual world. But Simon, as I mentioned earlier, is uploaded and then downloaded and embodied into a number of different forms. We know that virtual reality and virtual worlds are familiar experiences for a lot of people now, but only 8% of my sample of 128 would like to carry on as an avatar. Again, I don't know the reasons behind this, and it's something that I'd quite like to explore in future work, because there's lots of different potential to look at why people would choose a particular form and to maybe explore hybrid forms, which is something I didn't do in this study. So as you can see here, over half wanted a physical body. For a substantial proportion, there was a caveat to this. It depended what physical form we were going to be. So I can see quite a lot of interesting work about this in terms of the sort of form that we might want to exist in if we are uploaded and then downloaded. I suspect that some of the concerns about existing as an avatar is that we're used to being embodied. We're used to interacting with our own body, with the environment. The idea of living potentially forever as a virtual being is probably something that's quite uncomfortable for people. And people perhaps wonder if they were disconnected from the real world. Of course, there's another huge, great argument and discussion there outside my scope, but the extent to which, if you lived in virtual reality, it would have to be realistic, or would it have to be convincing? And the two things are different. And again, there's a lot of papers on that, which I've only just touched on, about the sort of requirements you might have for existing in a virtual world. One of the other things that Simon looks at is copies. Simon 1, as I can call him, is also seen as sort of Simon 2, Simon 3, and Simon 4. At one point, original Simon is still alive, while Simon 2 is woken up in a robot body. And towards the end of the game, there are two different scenarios for the ending, one of which, copy Simon, I think it's Simon 4 by this point, goes sailing off into space in an ark, which contains everybody's brain scans, the last of humanity. But there's also another scenario where he feels that he's been left behind. So there's some really interesting stuff in there about how would you feel if you were original Simon or original you or a copy of you. Now, obviously, that as a discussion is huge and it's way outside the scope of my empirical study. But what I found interesting is that more people than I might have expected, sort of 28%, would actually be okay to survive as a copy, which indicates to me maybe a willingness to trade off certain things if you could continue to live. So again, that's something that I'd quite like to explore going forward in a bit more depth. You don't get that much depth, obviously, in an online survey. It was great for collecting empirical data and giving me sort of facts and figures. And I did get some really interesting verbatim comments from people, but there are definitely some themes that I would like to dig into in a bit more depth. I also spent some time exploring subjective experience and people's understandings of whether or not they'd be you. The reason I did this is it's a really interesting part in SAMA where uploaded and then downloaded Simon. He's presented with what's effectively like a customer service questionnaire. And it says, do you think this is a new chapter in your life? Do you see it as a completely different beginning? There's some really interesting questions there. Theoretically, I can pull them apart. Some of the questions and some of the response options weren't traditionally what you would expect to see, but they did raise some really interesting questions. And although it's difficult to define and measure what it means if you're not truly you, the concept worries people, which I also find quite interesting because quite a few people are okay being a copy. So again, the more knotty and complex things that I wasn't really able to delve into in this study, I can definitely see offshoots of other work that I could potentially do with the public. So the next slide is something I had great fun with. You may well be familiar with something that in industry we call a projective technique. And all it is this concept that projective techniques give you a better range of responses compared to some direct questions, because it taps into thoughts and feelings that you may or may not be able to verbalize. They may be subconscious or unconscious. And all I did was literally say to people, complete the sentence. If I was an upload, I would feel. And I got really interesting results. Most of it was negative. There were lots of things like disconnected, weird, strange, anxious, which is understandable given it's a concept that we haven't experienced, we're not familiar with. And there were some really interesting quotes, some of which I've shown here, like incomplete, I wouldn't feel like I was myself, etc. There were some positives, though. People tended to talk about positives in the sense of, I think I'd be like quite scared initially and I wouldn't really know what was going on. But then once I'd actually got my head around it, it might be really good because I could push the boundaries and I could have new experiences. So you tended to find people started either, I could see lots of negatives, or some people were like, yeah, it'd be really weird and I'd have to adjust. But then I could see the positives, which was a really interesting discussion for me. So after this, the other thing I tried to explore was what would make the new existence and upload worth living. I deliberately asked this in a really vague and open-ended way. I didn't want to prescribe what people might come up with. There were lots and lots of different things, but there were some major ones, the ones that were shared. The most common reason for people wanting to continue as a mind uploaded being was that they would continue to be connected, mainly to loved ones, and that they would continue, hopefully, to experience feelings and emotions. And that connection is a really strong theme, that you'd still be able to be around, you'd be able to be supportive to your friends and family. They wouldn't just have lost you. And people assumed that you would be living in the sense that you wouldn't just be a static snapshot of yourself. As an upload, you would have some capacity, if you like, to grow and to learn. Brain stop then. The other thing I asked about was immortality and life extension. Yes, this is good. You're ahead of me now, Alison. So I made a distinction, living forever or immortality and life extension. And I defined life extension in this context as a fixed term of extra life, which you decide. And I chose that to indicate that they could control the span. I didn't say specifically that if you were living forever or immortality, you didn't have a choice. I did leave that open-ended. But from people's comments, what you tended to find is what scared people about potentially living forever is that you couldn't opt out, you didn't have the control. So for most people, the certainty or surety of I could live an extra 5, 10 years, 20 years was something they felt more comfortable with. And they said, if you control when you left the planet, when you died, however you want to discuss it, they would be able to plan in saying goodbye to loved ones. You wouldn't be in that situation, which I'm sure some of you have sadly experienced, when you lose somebody really sadly. You would be around to plan things as much as you could. And also you'd be able to experience life more, and maybe pursue these goals and dreams that you hadn't had time in your sort of natural lifespan. And people described it as life extension as control and certainty. It gave them a clown's death. Those who opted for immortality had two main reasons, and they're quite interesting. The first was a fear of death, just anxious, scared, didn't want to die, which is completely understandable. And they wanted to avoid death for themselves and also ideally loved ones, so they could all carry on to continue these relationships and continue that connectivity. The second reason for wanting immortality was a love of life and the wish and desire that you can carry on discovering and experiencing the world and perhaps have the time to do all those things you simply couldn't do for one reason or another in the lifespan that we are given. Why? Let's have a quick drink. The other thing I want to talk about, what people perceived, the positive and negative attributes of mind uploading. I looked at some prior research, there wasn't much. I looked through a lot of popular culture and I drew up a list of 13 potentially positives for mind uploading. Now, this was based on my understanding of the field, what I'd read about science and technology, so it might not be exhaustive. There may be other things, and I'm sure there are, outside the 13 positive attributes, but it was a starting point for investigation. And I did something really straightforward. I asked people to rank the 3 most appealing. 1, 2, 3. First place got 3 points, second place got 2 points, and the third place got 1. And what it showed was a really nice synergy with this idea of connectiveness and continuity, being there for loved ones after death. That's what people wanted. They wanted to still be around, to be able to communicate and share and support. After that, there was a perception that perhaps as an upload, you would be happier and you would be healthier because you wouldn't have physical pain. You potentially wouldn't have the sort of troubling things like dementia, which is obviously so devastating, particularly as you get older. So there was this idea that life would be nicer, shinier, happier, and you wouldn't hurt anymore, which is completely understandable as a plus. I followed the same process for negative attributes. Thank you so much. And as you can see, the fears around it are predominantly this idea of how people could abuse your mind and your brain, that they might abuse you, they might misuse you, they might torture you, depending on how the mind upload worked. And if you sat on a platform owned by somebody else, were you literally putting your mind in their hands? They worried about life losing its meaning. Perhaps if life stretched on forever in this immortal world, maybe you would find it meaningless. You wouldn't have a purpose. You wouldn't know what to do. And the other thing, apart from the fear of lack of privacy and abuse of your data in your mind, was the worry about that you'd just be a copy, and more that how would that work? What would happen if there were multiple copies of you? Who would be responsible? What happens if your copies made different choices? And I know quite a lot of these things have been discussed in the papers that I've read. There's been a lot of discussion around who would be liable if there are multiple copies of you, basically. But the biggest fear is the fear that somebody would have access to your most personal and private data, your brain and your mind. And what would they do with it? Which is completely understandable, and also obviously feeds into the discussion about protecting neuro rights that the Neuro Rights Foundation, for example, have been talking about. So the next thing I asked, I was completely in sync, was right towards the end. I said, would you upload your mind if your physical body was dying? And 38% were willing. And that, again, is an increase, because back in 2020, we only had 28% who were willing. And I find this interesting when you think about it, that the willingness to mind upload is underpinned by that significant increase in favourability. Again, I don't know why, and I'm fascinated by why. There's definitely some work to be done there, but it does seem that there is some indication of a trend that people are becoming more favourable to the concept and perhaps more willing to consider it hypothetically. This is slightly aside. It's just that one of the things I wanted to do with the website, obviously was to collect data. It's obviously part of my PhD. It was also to see, did it raise awareness of an engagement of mind uploading? And so I measured pre and post experience. Almost all of the people I spoke to, 86%, felt they were more aware, they'd learnt more about mind uploading. And the one thing I'm actually really proud of about the website is it worked so much better than I had expected. I really didn't know if it was going to enable people to put themselves in the shoes of the protagonists that I showed and really think about the topic. But it actually does. Not just the empirical data, but also the comments I've got. People are fascinated by the topic, and people who hadn't really thought about it before, I hadn't thought about this. It's really interesting. So I was really lucky that karmically, somehow that website worked really well, and it was a really good vehicle for engaging people and transporting them. I do have a whole load of data around that, as in narrative engagement, transportation, which I haven't shown here because that's obviously more method related, and this is much more around the empirical data from the public on mind uploading. So my last slide is literally just, I guess, a few thoughts from my point of view. Again, not completely exhaustive. I find it interesting that favourability is increasing significantly and that the number of people who would upload is increasing. Life extension appears, from my limited knowledge, to be becoming something that we are potentially more capable of achieving. And I think people are more comfortable with that rather than immortality, which again makes sense. It's like a slightly safer stepping stone, effectively. People can see benefits from mind uploading, particularly this idea of a continued connection to loved ones. But what they're worried about is the concerns that you see in the discussions around neuro rights, what people would do with their data. And although not many people have actually asked the public what they think about neuro rights and neurotechnology, the things that they worry about seem to be similar to the things that the policymakers and scientists are talking about, although public priorities sometimes differ, which of course you can understand completely. It's very difficult when different when you're talking about you as a person rather than just looking at a more global concept, basically. So that's the end of me waffling. The next two slides are basically references if you want to look into anything else. I'm just going to open up the chat because I was very conscious that I was yapping away and I hadn't answered any questions. I'm opening myself up for abuse and questioning.
Yeah, I think we had Micah. I think I also saw possibly Aurelia with a question there earlier. So I want to make sure that you guys get your chance. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks a lot, Angela. That was very informative. Really appreciated. And Micah, you go.
The same question as Aurelius. A few of the charts you showed had no x-axis label, and it wasn't clear what the three bars were.
Very slobby of me. Which ones are you thinking about particularly?
They're showing like your numbers of after you did your that one, for example. What do those three different bars represent?
Let me just look at that. That's the top. Yes, that's the top two. Sorry, I didn't label that. That's appalling. That's the top two box, which is 31. So people scoring 4 and 5. The bottom two box, so people scoring 1 and 2. So the non-aware end of the scale, if you like. And then the -16 is basically meta-awareness. So the top two box scoring 4 and 5 minus the bottom two box scoring 1 or 2. So taking out that middle zone of 3. So more people are unaware than aware, if that makes sense. But apologies for bad labeling.
The other slide that needs explaining, you guys?
I still have a question. I still don't understand what that means. What do the 3 bars mean? Each bar is the top 2 minus the bottom 2, but for what? Is it years?
Let me try again. I always explain that very badly. So I used a 5-point scale. So 1 was not at all aware and 5 was extremely aware. The top two box is the number of people who scored 4, so very aware of mind uploading, plus the number of people who scored 5, so extremely aware. And that was basically 31% of people scored 4 or 5. The 47% is the percentage of people that scored not at all aware or not very aware, so 1 or 2. So 47% of people were not at all or not very aware of mind uploading. And the -16 is simply the top 2 minus the bottom 2. So net.
Oh.
I didn't
There's
explain
only
that
really
well.
2 bars here. There's only really 2
Yes.
bars. The third one's derivative of the first.
Yes, sorry. You explained that much better than I did.
Okay.
Other slide that anyone wants to go back to, just because we have them open right now.
Just so this slide is for 2020, and then there's another slide after this for 2024.
I don't
That's
think
post-website favorability?
there is a slide for, let me just go back. Bear with me.
Because there's a pre-website, and then is there a post-website to compare that one to?
No, there isn't a post website on this, that in the chart, but there is a figure, which I'm now trying to find. Bear with me. 86% were more aware after the website. Does that make sense? But I haven't done a top 2 and a bottom 2 box, although I could do if you wanted one. That might not have answered your question.
Sorry to keep asking this, but like, where's the post-website one? It's like there's you could have made a graph exactly like this for the post-website.
I could have done, and I didn't.
Alex.
And I should have done. No, I didn't.
The data's in this presentation though. So like, what would the numbers be?
Hold on a second, let me find it. Bear with me. I know I should know it off by heart, but it's been a while. I'm just going. My brain has completely shut down. I haven't got a chart. Can you leave that with me? I will check it because I know I should know it, but I can't find it.
We can
Is that
send it
right?
afterwards.
I'll send it over. Sorry.
I'm going to be the distributor here.
Yes, I will find a nice clear chart that answers that question.
We also have, I think, a question from Randall. If you want.
Hello, Randall.
Randall, if you're talking.
I can't hear Randall now.
Yeah, maybe you're muted, or no, you're not muted, but we can't hear you. If you want to talk louder or check the volume on your device, or you can also just put your questions in the chat, then I can just ask it out loud if that's better.
We love technology. Makes a really good point about people being better able to imagine what the concepts would be like. What I noticed that actually the stuff that's out there, like Upload and Soma, actually and Black Mirror, tend to be quite dystopian. Don't seem to see as great story that I feel is positive. Hello, Randall. I can see a hand.
Maybe we'll get back to Nathan's comment in a sec now that Randall's here, but I would love us to explore that too, because it's a really good point. But yeah, Randall, if you want to ask your question now that you're with us.
Yeah, so you can actually hear me at the moment?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I wanted to say it's wonderful to see you presenting your dissertation work here, Angela. That's fantastic. And anyway, but yeah, so I have 2 questions, actually, if I can briefly go through them. So I was really interested in what aspect of mind uploading was the most difficult to get across? What was the topic? What was the aspect of it that you found was really hard to communicate?
Okay. I didn't get feedback on how hard it was to communicate in the online survey, because obviously people was pretty much stuck with what I put together. But when I did some earlier qualitative work, the thing that I found people really struggle with is the idea that mind uploading was in some way macabre or against the laws of nature or against the laws of religion. That seems to be the biggest thing that people really struggle with. And it's not just about getting their head around how mind uploading might fit with their spiritual or religious beliefs. It's quite an instinctive emotional reaction, which makes it really hard to discuss and rationalize. I don't know whether that answers your question.
I think it probably does. I was just wondering if there were any real communication issues, because I know with your whole background in marketing, you have tons of experience in how to communicate with people about various things, all kinds of topics. And so one thing that I've run into is that sometimes it's very difficult to communicate about topics that either people aren't already used to, that have
Yes.
been distorted by sci-fi, or that for some other reason. And that's why I was curious. The macabre, that's definitely an issue, yeah.
I spent a long time getting to the website precisely because of the difficulty of communication I had doing the early qualitative research. And that was the thing I alluded to about people took a position, and I'm sure you've come across this, and they stuck to it. And it didn't matter how you approached it, and it didn't matter what techniques you used or what tone of voice or whatever. It didn't matter how you set a group up. People would pick a position, and it would be really difficult to make them think about it from a different perspective. And that's precisely why I ended up looking at human-computer interaction and looking to see what games potentially did, stories potentially did, in terms of making people actually stop and engage with it and maybe think a bit deeper. That's how I ended up with the website, was that difficulty.
So then I guess my second question, which maybe is attached to the first one, is in discussing with people these two concepts of life extension or immortality, how was that presented? What was for them, what was the difference between it? Because in my head, immortality just seems to be, the definition of immortality would have to be, you cannot in any possible way cease living. There's no way to turn it off. It will continue forever.
Yes.
Even if the universe disappears, you just keep on going.
Yes.
Life extension means some short extension where either you don't get to determine how long that is, it could be an extra 10 years, or it could be basically like immortality, but you have an off switch. So those would be, for me, the definitions. Is that how it was discussed with everyone?
As in the sense of immortality was defined as living forever. I didn't actually stipulate whether or not there was an off button, but interestingly, people assumed that there wasn't, in line with your theory. They assumed that you would just keep living. And potentially that might be wonderful, potentially that might not be so great, depending on the circumstances. I presented life extension in this context as a defined, planned period, so you could turn it off. There are probably other ways of discussing it, and there are probably maybe better ways of presenting it. But the nutshell for me was like the on-off switch, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
We now have lots of questions in here. Aurelia, you also still have your hand raised. I don't know if your question is still relevant or not, or Micah, if your question is still relevant or not. Otherwise, I take one from the chat. Okay, cool. The chat question, is yours still relevant, Aurelia, or not?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, then you go for it. You've had your hand raised for a long time.
So I have a theory that people's favorability of mind uploading is dependent upon their ability to seriously think about it, and that their ability to seriously think about it radically increases if they're actually terminally ill. And I'm wondering if any of the people you talked with were terminally ill, and if you would expect there to be much of a difference in the survey.
That's a really good question. I don't know whether anybody I spoke to was terminally ill. it's possible. I recruited to Prolific, which is a global platform. You might be on there, but I don't specifically know. It is a really interesting question, and it would be a great thing to research. Obviously, the ethics around talking to terminally ill people are quite complex in terms of what you can and cannot discuss. But I could imagine, I agree with you, I can imagine that attitudes could shift if you were close to the end of life. I can't support that in any way, but it makes sense to me.
If they've had a major health scare, that seems to be good enough too. Anyways.
Yes, no, I think that's a perfectly reasonable theory to me. And I think just from a personal point of view, if you've ever had a health scare, you've ever had somebody suddenly become ill, that does make you reframe and reconsider life, potentially. And if you think about what people were saying about they wouldn't lose loved ones suddenly, maybe if everybody had some kind of life extension or immortality, people wouldn't just get pulled away from you quickly. That to me does indicate that kind of experience changes your viewpoint, if that makes sense. That is a really good question, and that would be really interesting research to do. Fraught with ethical problems, and I can imagine a very long ethics application, but it would be interesting.
We have a general comment more about what would it take to possibly change our public opinion, and like one suggestion here being that like we need better sci-fi stories, these films, TV series, whatever. And I think you showed Upload. Then it was suggested there's like Pantheon, and then it could also possibly be useful to have more people maybe engage with a Permutation City or others like it. Do you know any other, I guess, sci-fi related concepts or like stories, movies, TV series that deal with mind uploading?
More positively. I don't, but that doesn't mean I'm definitely not the world's repository on sci-fi. I had never even heard of Pantheon, and it is a perfectly reasonable criticism of that.
But it is hard to find.
Yes,
it would be good if
Yes.
someone could just upload it very easy to find.
Yeah. But it is a perfectly reasonable question that mind uploading was framed by the seamless material I was able to access. In the ideal world, and I did actually pitch for far too many 100,000 in the vague hope somebody would let me build a website or a game, because that to me would be really interesting, because I was limited by what I could access and what I could use. But I think most of it is fairly dystopian. But again, there are people on this forum who've no doubt read far more than me.
All right, awesome. I think like one thing that really inspired me was Letter from Utopia from Bostrom. It's not quite a sci-fi story, but it's basically like beings in the futures that are uploads writing back to us currently existing to bring them into existence and their lives and what they're like and how they're like qualitatively different and better than our lives, even though we might not be able to totally imagine them. And it's a short letter and it's quite succinct. Maybe I'll share that around as well with the follow-up.
Yes.
We're unfortunately out of time, but this was really interesting. I think that you have a lot more comments and like other questions that people really want the public to comment on, including, for example, if mind uploading or emulation would be a better term to use. I would think that's also quite interesting to just prompt people like what is a lot of their perceptions.
Topic of definitions.
I've had that conversation with Randall.
Yeah, but just like what causes more positive reactions in people or something. Yeah, but
Yeah.
this was really exciting. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. And thanks a lot for your great questions. I'm sure that there's a lot more to unpack, and hopefully it was
And
not
I will
outdated,
find
but
my
I'm doing good.
painful missing slide and send it through.
That would be great. Yeah, thanks everyone. Unfortunately, I have to hop to the next meeting now, but I'm sure we could keep going at this for days. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you coming.
Wonderful, Angela. Thanks.
Have a good
Bye.
Okay, speak to you soon. Bye.